In the context of the war in Ukraine, there have been a lot of questions about the role of the United Nations. Many wonder why this institution cannot intervene in stopping this war, or at least act as a referee in this situation. We have seen Russia use its veto to stop a motion against its own actions. We have also heard about the war crimes and international law, but no clear action to prevent those crimes. We are here today to discuss these issues with one of Canada's leading experts, Mr. John McNee. During his extensive career, Mr. McNee was a Canadian ambassador in Belgium, Syria, and Lebanon, and he was Canada's representative to the Council of Europe. Within the federal government, Mr. McNee worked as Assistant Deputy Minister with the Department of External Affairs, and he also worked in the Foreign and Defense Policy Secretariat of the Privy Council Office. He was also Canada's permanent representative to the United Nations from 2006 to 2011, and was the Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism from 2011 to 2019. Good morning, Mr. McNee. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
With great pleasure, and I'm delighted to be at the Institute on Governance talking about these issues today. So thank you, Francois, for the invitation.
I think there are lots of people who have questions about the United Nations these days because it's in the news everywhere. Could you tell us a little bit about the United Nations, how it works, and how it gets things done?
The United Nations was founded right at the end of the Second World War. Canada was one of the about 50 countries who were part of the creation, and Canada's made a big contribution ever since, both in terms of our financial contribution, of our ideas, and of our people who work in and with the UN system. It has three big purposes: maintaining international peace and security, that's the first one; economic and social development, under which I would also include the environment and humanitarian affairs and Indigenous questions, and human rights and the rule of law. But those are the three fundamental purposes of the organization. In terms of its structure, I always think of it as really not one organization. It's very complicated, but I think of four UNs. The first one is the Security Council, which has 15 members. 5 of them are permanent members, so they are there from the beginning to the end, and they are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. And then 10 who serve for 2-year terms, and they rotate on and off, and as Canada has done 4 times, I think, since the beginning. Then you have the General Assembly. Now, the General Assembly is like the Parliament of the United Nations. It has 193 members. That's virtually every country in the world. It's like a parliament with 193 parties, so it's a difficult body, but it's the closest thing to representing the view and the opinion of the international community on an issue. Third, you have the Secretary General, who serves both the Security Council and the General Assembly with a bureaucracy of some 6,000 people who work for him, helping set the agenda and implement the decisions. And then fourth, over time have developed all the UN funds, programs, and specialized agencies. People in Canada will certainly know of UNICEF, which is the Children's Fund, the World Health Organization, which has been very much in the news the last couple of years over the pandemic, the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal, which regulates civil aviation, and there are a ton, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and on and on. There's one that regulates the International Postal System, and on. So those are the 4 big constituent parts of the UN.
So you talked to us about the Security Council. That's an interesting point because they have the power to stop wars and to coerce members into doing things. Where does that power come from?
So let's go back to the beginning, because I think it helps explain what's happening today. The idea of the United Nations really came from at a time in the middle of the Second World War when Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt got together to try and look towards the future and how could the community of nations prevent another global war. And they came up with the idea of the United Nations. The 5 leading powers who fought fascism were granted, as when the Charter of the UN was negotiated, special responsibilities for maintaining peace and security, special responsibilities and obligations, but also powers. They were to be on the Security Council in permanency and the power to veto a decision. At the time, they were like-minded. That they had worked together, they had fought together despite their huge differences. The Soviet Union, the Marxist-Leninist state, and the democracies, and so on. So it wasn't supposed to turn out the way it has today. That is to say, the veto was designed to enable those five to protect a vital national interest, but not to give them a shield when they were behaving in a way contrary to the UN Charter, contrary to all the accepted principles. And I'm afraid that's what you're seeing today. But the origins made perfect sense at the time to prevent another global conflict.
That's what people wonder very often is why do the superpowers get a veto at that council when they're very frequently the worst offenders?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure they're the worst offenders. I mean, I'm really not. Because look at some of the conflicts in the last 30 years. You had the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. You had Milosevic in Serbia launching war on Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. You have all sorts of conflicts in Africa, terrible ones in Darfur, both with ethnic cleansing within countries and transport. So I'm not sure they're the worst, but that's the reality, that the system is predicated on those five countries working together to prevent conflicts, and sometimes they have ignored that principle.
So you're saying that these countries may have their own interest to protect their own security. This is what Russia is saying about Ukraine. Right. This is also what the U.S. was saying about Iraq before they invaded Iraq in the 2000s. Right. So what's the difference here?
And some of you may recall that the United States presented its case to the United Nations Security Council seeking concurrence for taking military action in Iraq. And they said they believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that in their interpretation of international law, there was justification for a preemptive action to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. So that was a justification. I should say in parenthesis that Canada did not accept that. We were not persuaded that there was evidence, and Prime Minister Chrétien made it clear that unless the Security Council approved of a military action, that Canada wouldn't support it. And there was a great cleavage among the Western countries, with the United Kingdom siding with the United States, France and Germany and Canada and others saying no. But at least I think it would be fair to say that it was a subject of real debate and honest disagreement. It's not as if the United States was alone at the time. There was quite a coalition of countries who were in agreement, from Australia to Spain to the United Kingdom. I mean, there were a very large number who were supportive, and a large number who weren't. So in this case, I think that the evidence or the justification for a Russian invasion of Ukraine is almost non-existent. It's almost completely manufactured. No one has come up, the Russians haven't come up with any real proof that Ukrainians were victimizing, harming Russian speakers in the country. I mean, none, zero. So one, I think there was a genuine debate and honest disagreement, and one of completely manufactured pretext for an aggressive war.
So what we're talking about is really right now, the Security Council is locked. It cannot make a decision to stop the war because there will always be a veto from one of the permanent members, which is Russia.
Right.
So the next best thing to do for the United Nations would be to move to the General Assembly. Right. Now, we have seen a vote in the General Assembly recently, and it's interesting that there's only a very limited amount of countries who voted against.
Right.
That blame for Russia, but however, there's quite a significant number of countries who abstained.
Right.
So isn't abstaining really the same thing as voting against it or not voting for it, I would say?
Okay. So first, what does an abstention mean in the United Nations concept, in the United Nations context? It doesn't mean that I don't have a view. What it means is that while a country might be generally in favor of a proposition, there's something about it that is important to them that they can't support. There were 141 countries who voted in favor of the resolution, and this was a rare instance where the General Assembly took up a matter of peace and security that was urgent and where the rules permit them to do so when the Security Council is deadlocked. 141 for. Over 90 of those 141 were what they call co-sponsors. So they were enthusiastically behind it, and Canada one of those. 5 voted against, and then there were 35 abstentions, and 12 countries who just didn't vote. They didn't show. And so how do you explain those 35 abstentions and the 12 who chose not to vote on something this important? Now, the 35 who abstained, there were some important countries, China and India, for starters, and quite a fair number of African countries and a few here and there. And that holds for the 12 who didn't vote out. So I think you have to understand their abstentions not because they supported the invasion. If they'd supported the invasion, they might have voted no. But in terms of their close and important bilateral relations with Russia, either as a supplier of arms or of political support or economic assistance of one kind or another. I think that explains the 35. And I was going to say, Francois, that in UN terms, a verdict like that, 141 in favor, 5 against, and 47 not expressing a view, is a pretty smashing victory. Condemnation. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Russia finds itself extremely isolated at the UN.
However, the General Assembly cannot take action further to that. Aside from blaming and shaming, naming and shaming, they can't do an action like the Security Council can do. There was something that we also saw in the past, in some cases where there were war, called the Blue Helmets. Can they do anything?
Well, it's an intriguing idea, but I think that probably the answer is no, because the UN peacekeepers, the so-called Blue Helmets, the fundamental condition for them to be deployed successfully is that the parties to a conflict have to accept their deployment. They've worked where there's been a conflict. The parties are close to agreeing on a ceasefire, but they're still far away from a resolution. So in between, something to maintain the peace, to permit them then to more quietly, with the benefit of time, discuss and conclude a peace treaty. And that's been effective. Or sometimes it hasn't led to a peace treaty, but it's maintained the peace. I was Canadian ambassador to Syria, and on the Golan Heights, UN peacekeeping force, which Canada contributed to for many years, maintaining in effect, the truce between Israel and Syria, and the same in Cyprus between the Greek and the Turkish Cypriots. So I think, sadly, I don't think that it's possible. Once again, it would have to be authorized by the Security Council, and then you're back to where we started, which is the Russian opposition and the Russian veto. If we just go back for a sec to my 4 component parts of the UN, I mean, they are all very engaged by this conflict. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Program, UNICEF, are all leading the coordination of humanitarian assistance faced with this enormous refugee crisis. 10 million Ukrainians have been displaced, 6.5 million within their own country. They've had to move. 3.5 have made it abroad. I mean, this is an enormous refugee crisis, the like of which we haven't seen in a long time. So those UN agencies are leading the coordination for the whole international community. The Secretary General is very engaged in efforts to try and find the basis for some kind of a negotiated solution. So the UN system is very engaged. Yeah.
So the part of the UN that provides assistance, for example, is not bound to a resolution of the Security Council.
No, these organizations have their own mission and mandate, their own funding, often coming from what are called voluntary contributions from wealthier countries like Canada, and so they don't require any authorization for particular acts of humanitarian action. Yeah.
So if the Security Council and the General Assembly are limited, I should say, in the actions that they can take, one of the things that we've been hearing in the news lately also, and we saw the Secretary of State of the United States accusing Russia of war crimes. Right. So if there's a war crime, that means it's a crime against the law. Right. And if it's a law, where does that law come from if every country is sovereign and every country has their own legislation?
The idea that there should be agreed rules for armed conflict goes way back into the Middle Ages. That was a time when you didn't have total war as we know it today. You had small armies, and the idea that you needed to have rules to determine what was permissible in terms of the conflict, what to do about prisoners, and these were some of the big, and this evolved over time. The First World War and the Second World War gave great impetus to fleshing out further the framework for dealing with the laws of war, and then it was really the Holocaust and the genocide of the Second World War which gave rise to the concepts which were articulated at the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi leaders of crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. There are four main Geneva Conventions. People will hear about the Geneva Conventions that address the different aspects. And then in the 90s, the International Criminal Court was created with the idea that if there were the worst crimes, so genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, if there was no effective prosecution of someone who had committed those, individuals who had committed those crimes, that they could be brought to justice before the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and that has happened on several occasions. So there is a whole body of law that addresses these issues.
You're talking about them being brought to justice, but for people to be brought to justice, usually you need the cops in some kind, shape, or form. Yeah. You know, you need some enforcement people who actually are chasing those people who are offenders and are bringing them to justice. In this case, there doesn't seem to be a cop somewhere.
But neither did there seem to be with Milosevic. Huh? He was in power. He was the president of Serbia. Yeah, in the future, things could change. You know, and then you could have a different government in Russia who might say, well, these 10 people that you've have been identified, we will facilitate them, we will hand them over for trial in The Hague. If there is an indictment of some of the leading Russian figures, again, that indictment by the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court is a pretty strong signal that the international community finds something terrible has happened here and is blaming those people. So I wouldn't like to be in the position of someone on the end. It would also reinforce the sanctions. You wouldn't travel anywhere outside of Russia for fear that if you that's where the police will be. They'll be waiting for you when you get off the plane.
So basically, other countries enforce that.
Other countries who are signatory to the statutes of the International Criminal Court.
And then their own country could eventually enforce it if at some point the government changes there. We hear a lot that diplomacy is the way out of the war. What's the role of diplomacy in all of this? And is there hope, basically, in talking each other out of the war?
In the end, there will have to be a negotiated solution, negotiated by diplomats and political leaders. I think that's the only way I can see, unless there were to be a complete Russian victory. That doesn't seem at all likely. So because of the courageous and effective Ukrainian resistance, the failures of the Russian military and so on. So you're going to have to find some common ground. So the short answer is yes, and there are all sorts of efforts. I can assure you that the UN Secretary General will be talking to Putin. He'll be talking to President Biden. He will be talking to the President of Ukraine. He'll be talking to the European leaders. He'll be exploring what might the elements of a negotiated solution, what might it look like. There's talk of Austria as a model, so a neutral Western country not belonging to NATO. That could be a model for Ukraine. That was attractive. There are all sorts of quiet efforts to find some kind of way out. But until now, the Russian president has not given any indication of wanting to move. So he's pursuing the war. So for now, those efforts have not yielded much, even trying to negotiate humanitarian corridors so that women and children can get out of the eastern and southern Ukraine where the fighting's taking place. So I think there's no other realistic solution but a negotiated one.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. McNee. It's been a very, very interesting conversation, and our heart goes to the people of both Ukraine and Russia who are suffering and will be suffering for a long time from this war. And we really hope that there's going to be a peaceful solution in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. It was my great pleasure to be with you.